Loneliness is a strange and overwhelming emotion. But it can also be seen not as an emotion itself, but rather an absence of other feelings. To put it technically, loneliness is a response to isolation. It's the unpleasant experience that occurs when a person's social network is deficient in a significant way. It's caused by the deprivation of universal needs like love, community, and a sense of belonging. And it's an overwhelmingly strong force that can influence our actions, motivations, and desires in a way that at first we may not even realize. And science tells us that loneliness has rapidly become more common than it ever was before among people living in developed countries. And few artists have illustrated the slow descent of loneliness on our collective subconsciousness better than Kevin Parker, the man behind Tame Impala. In this video, I'm gonna dive into his catalog and look at the way he uses music to represent the human mind as a deep, expansive landscape, traveling through his own psyche on a psychedelic journey to discover himself and understand his disconnect from the world around him. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. You can also get access to my streaming video service, Nebula, when you sign up for CuriosityStream using the link in the description. We're all a little extra lonely these days. I should know, I'm a YouTuber. My job is to entertain hundreds of thousands of people without knowing any of them. But that's just one extreme anecdote. Many Americans report that they have no one to talk to or confide in, much more than even just 20 years ago. Statistics tell us that we have less friends than in the past, too. Most people only have 2 friends that they could tell something serious to. And if anyone has been in touch with loneliness throughout history, it's the artists of the world. The artists who already see life in a strange, bittersweet way. From legendary painter Vincent van Gogh spending his most creative years completely on his own with no connection to the outside world, to massively impactful author George Orwell citing loneliness as the driving factor behind his writing, lonely artists have made their mark on the world. Because the lonely mind sees things in a different light. Innocuous moments and subtle movements take on a new level of meaning when your mind isn't distracted by other people. And no contemporary music recreates that feeling of melancholy solitude better than that of Tame Impala. Tame Impala is sort of a band, but it's also kind of not. Kevin Parker is the lone multi-instrumentalist who writes, records, and produces all of the band's music. He has a touring band who play with him during live shows, but when it's time to get in the studio, it's usually just him. And Kevin's preference to work alone isn't that surprising when you learn more about him. You see, Kevin Parker, like many of us, didn't grow up in the most stable environment. His parents divorced when he was 4, then got back together, then broke up again. The stress turned him into an unstable kid, and he spent a lot of time alone. And when he wasn't alone, he was acting out. He started smoking weed at 12. He got into graffiti and stealing. But as he continued to grow up, Kevin got quiet and went into a shell. And by the time he finished high school, he had found a love for music. In a 2012 interview with Rollo and Grady, Kevin talked about making DIY multi-track recordings, starting with a tape recording of a drum beat, and then using a second tape recorder to record a piano melody while the first recorder played back the drum beat. But Kevin's dad, who was also an amateur musician, wanted him to go to college. So Kevin started studying for a degree in astronomy while working on his music career. Fast forward a few years and Kevin gets a call from the Australian record label Modular while on the way to his final college exam. They offered to sign him and he immediately compiled a selection of songs for his first release. The Tame Impala EP, which dropped in late 2008, is a 5-track project running 20 minutes in length. It's compiled from recordings from as far back as 2003 when Kevin was 18 years old. There's not one song on the EP that was originally intended to ever be released to the public, but rather, Kevin had made the recordings for his own enjoyment. The Tame Impala EP's cover art was done by Kevin himself as well. It's an interpretation of a slide he saw in astronomy class. It illustrates the size of 3 different stars, Antares, Mira, and the Sun. The EP was noted for its fuzzy, bassy production, psychedelic riffs, and vocal performances from Kevin that resulted in enough John Lennon comparisons to buy the Brooklyn Bridge. But at the same time, there was a good amount of listeners that just didn't like the EP that much. Going through old reviews on rateyourmusic.com, you can see that a lot of people just weren't impressed. But there was enough there, especially on songs like Desire Be, Desire Go, and Half Full Glass of Wine, that the EP received a good amount of radio airplay in Australia. A fan base started to form in anticipation of the first Tame Impala album, and during the year following the release of the EP, Kevin and his newly recruited live band toured with the Black Keys, MGMT, and other bands, opening shows for them around the world. The Tame Impala EP's lyrical content was pretty varied, having been written over a period of years without any specific theme in mind. Topics varied from isolation and paranoia on Half Full Glass of Wine, to optimistic nihilism on Skeleton Tiger, and surreal astronomy on The Sun. Fast forward a year and a half to the spring of 2010, and it's time for the release of the first Tame Impala record, Innerspeaker. Innerspeaker presents the first release of Tame Impala music that was actually recorded with intention to be heard by the public. Seeing as in the past, Kevin had only ever made recordings for his own personal enjoyment, there was a lot of room to improve with his newfound access to equipment and resources from his label. But despite his success and rise to prominence, Kevin once again wrote, recorded, produced, and mixed Innerspeaker largely by himself, with only a few small exceptions. The recording process for Innerspeaker was actually pretty interesting. But if you're interested in winning the vinyls shown in this video, you can go follow Volksgeist on Instagram after the video is over and check out my most recent post for instructions on how to win all the vinyls Tame Impala has ever released. But back to the story. In order to record Innerspeaker, Kevin first traveled to a town on the coast of southern Australia with a population of just over 1,000 people. He was 4 hours away from the nearest city with no access to phones, computers, or television. But he did have a 180-degree view of the Indian Ocean from his front window. However, his environment was hardly luxurious. The roof leaked and the power wasn't reliable enough to stay on all day. Kevin often lost drum tracks and even sometimes whole songs due to power outages. But in spite of the technical difficulties, Kevin recorded the vast majority of the album by the sea, saying that the amazing scenery had an incredible effect on his creativity, and he couldn't have made Innerspeaker without it. After the majority of the album was finished, Kevin ventured back to Civilization to polish it off and get ready for release. And this is where the process became challenging. Kevin needed to collaborate with others to get Innerspeaker to sound just right. Tame Impala's touring members helped record a few finishing touches, but that was the easy part. After a period of frustration, Kevin had to give up on his goal of mixing and producing the record by himself. Things just didn't sound right, and he was afraid he would never be able to finish it. So he reluctantly hands the recordings off to a professional engineer who was able to make the album sound just how Kevin wanted it. Kevin has later talked about how at first he didn't want to collaborate with an engineer. It was an invaluable learning experience that practically saved the album. And last but not least, Kevin set out to design the album's artwork by himself, before quickly realizing he lacked the skills and resources to make it happen. And so Innerspeaker's final artwork was created by an Australian artist named Leif Podaski. The artwork features a picture taken at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the United States. It was altered using the Drost effect, an artistic concept in which the picture appears recursively within itself. Kevin has later talked about how Leif's cover art ended up being a perfect representation of the music, in a way that Kevin would not have been able to convey on his own. Innerspeaker was a hit. Thanks to Kevin's more structured and intentional production process, the album was much more mature and complete than the previous Tame Impala EP. Innerspeaker charted at number 4 in Australia, but it struggled to reach international audiences, peaking at number 144 on the UK albums charts, and not even reaching the charts in the US. And in the end, I think what kept Innerspeaker from truly bringing Tame Impala to a worldwide audience was its sort of wild, untamed sound. The album was by no means bad. It was just too abstract for the pop audience that Tame Impala would later come to dominate. And look, don't get me wrong, critics loved the album. It's just that Innerspeaker was very, very true to its psychedelic roots. It was recorded in the Australian wilderness in a shack, for God's sake, and you can easily tell that was the case. Innerspeaker doesn't have many standout singles. The album flows together amazingly well as one long listening experience, and sure enough, 10 years later, its 11 tracks all have an extremely similar number of streams on Spotify. It's definitely an album to be listened to from beginning to end. And lyrically, Innerspeaker is truly a look into Kevin's mind. It opens with goes to the Australian wilderness to make music. And musically, I find Innerspeaker to be extremely interesting. The texture in Kevin's guitar is colorful and lively, and you can almost feel the unique wilderness environment in which the album was recorded. The album is true to its psychedelic roots, and it makes up for what it lacks in individuality from song to song with a high level of energy throughout the entire album. The songs are dynamic, high tempo, and they flow together beautifully. But Kevin still couldn't shake those John Lennon comparisons, and honestly, I can understand why. He sounds exactly like the Beatles singer, and a lot of production choices on Innerspeaker were pretty heavily inspired by the Beatles as well, even if they did adhere to more modern sensibilities. I remember one review I read where the critic wrote that Innerspeaker was born as the result of an alternate universe in which John Lennon joins Led Zeppelin after Robert Plant's airplane disappears somewhere over the Congo. Another person, somewhat less charitably, wrote that an Australian hobo dropped the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour into a vat of reverb, and the whole world called it revolutionary. So the divided audience was definitely still a thing. But I think Innerspeaker is a really good listen. The only thing it was missing to bring Tame Impala to a worldwide audience was more palatable songs that stand out on their own, rather than melding together as one brilliant, albeit long, psychedelic journey. And that's exactly where Lonerism comes in. Kevin started working on the next Tame Impala album immediately after finishing Innerspeaker. For him, it was easier to just jump into the next thing rather than let the pressure to make a more successful follow-up slowly grow and start to hinder his creativity. But he was also on the road touring Innerspeaker, and so his recording process resulted in a much different flow and structure in the new record, Lonerism. Lonerism is roughly the same length as Innerspeaker, but it moves differently. Kevin had started experimenting heavily with sampling and synths, resulting in a sound that was both more psychedelic and more friendly to casual listeners. He used a recording device to record ambient noise for sampling in the album, expanding on Tame Impala's reputation for lo-fi production. My favorite example of this is the muffled dinner party you can hear towards the end of track 8, Keep On Lying. It does the perfect job of making the listener feel like they're being excluded from something, putting us in the same headspace as Kevin while he was writing the album. Kevin also wanted to channel his love for pop music, focusing more on melodies and catchy songwriting. His new creative direction resulted in a much more accessible album, with a number of songs that stand out as hit singles without leaving his meditative psych rock roots behind. Lonerism presents an important step in Kevin's evolution as a writer and a recording artist. But if you couldn't tell from the record's name, he's hardly all grown up. Lonerism, similarly to Innerspeaker, is largely written about Kevin's struggle with social isolation. A struggle that would only grow as Kevin continued to tour the world for Innerspeaker, partying in different cities and talking to people everywhere. Kevin told the Whitsunday Times, an Australian newspaper, that touring made him realize he wasn't a people person, and that he often couldn't even talk to people without feeling stupid, or like he wanted to go home and never leave the house again. And that had a huge influence on the tone of Lonerism. Innerspeaker was in many ways a blissful album. It's a solitary drive to the beach, or a lonely vacation in the forest. Kevin was oblivious to the true levels of loneliness he could experience after becoming famous because Innerspeaker was so successful. Lonerism is the realization of Kevin becoming famous and realizing he truly is a loner. It's a very different feeling. The innocence is gone. The album's cover art features a picture Kevin took while touring in Paris, and it brilliantly illustrates what I'm talking about. Lonerism is beautiful. It's well composed and it sounds amazing. And Kevin was only able to pull that off because he felt more isolated than ever before. Just look at it. I mean, he's behind bars looking at a crowd of people. How much more obvious does it get? And Lonerism was a huge hit. It was almost unanimously considered one of the best albums of 2012, winning multiple awards and charting at number 34 in the US. Lonerism was even nominated for a Grammy. Long story short, Lonerism massively boosted Tame Impala's popularity by incorporating a more poppy sound into the music. But in spite of Kevin's newfound status as one of the most prominent rock musicians in the world, he didn't want to rest on his success. Instead, Kevin dove into his own mind, and he created an album that would become his most successful work yet, while also being wildly different from anything he had done before. The album I'm talking about is, of course, Currents. Currents was a huge curveball. Now, it still sounds like Tame Impala, for sure. It's just full of new ideas, left turns, gooey synths, heavy bass, and broad, expansive soundscapes. What's different, though, is that the album is very light on guitars. Rather, Currents makes use of psychedelic, electronic, pop, disco, and most heavily, R&B sounds. Kevin later talked about listening to tons of pop and R&B while writing and recording the album. He expanded, saying that letting go of indie pretentiousness and just making music that he wanted to make was liberating, and that the only reason he didn't get into R&B before was because his audience would have turned their noses at it. And there were practical reasons for Current's sound too. Kevin was on the road so often that most of the time he couldn't bring his guitars with him. And yes, he did want to branch out and do something more poppy. He also just didn't know where his guitars were most of the time, while he was performing in different countries every month. But he did have access to a large number of synths and drum machines, and so they became the instrumentation most prominently featured on Currents. And while many people listen to Currents as a breakup album, I see it more as a record about growing older and moving on. It's the most clearly autobiographical Tame Impala album yet, but I'm not trying to say that previous Tame Impala albums aren't autobiographical. It's just that on Currents, Kevin's vocals are much clearer and less affected than before. He doesn't sound like John Lennon anymore. He sounds like himself. Currents is an exploration of Kevin's mind. He looks at his own wrongdoings and examines them, not from a selfish viewpoint, but rather he tries to accept his own wrongdoings and move past them. He talks to his old self, finding different ways to accept the natural currents of life and go with the flow. While many of the songs on Currents are about failed relationships, the message isn't about the relationship itself. It's about the many different lessons Kevin has learned over the years and his path towards confidence and self-acceptance. And that's why it's so different from everything he's made before. The opening track, Let It Happen, illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. Over the course of the song, Kevin finds peace with the chaos in his life, deciding to let it happen and be part of it, rather than trying in vain to shut it out. The cover art for Currents depicts vortex shutting, which is a term used to describe the way liquid or air flows around objects. In other words, Kevin, weathering the storm of life. Currents was massive, even compared to Lonerism. Thanks to its unusual genre choices and more coherent vocal delivery, the album peaked at number 4 on the US Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 in Australia. It charted in the top 10 in the UK, Spain, Portugal, New Zealand, Ireland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Critics described Currents as having an air of solitude, and that Kevin somehow managed to keep the album true to the spirit of Tame Impala while also pushing production boundaries and abandoning the fuzzy guitar sound that made the band so popular in the first place. But Currents wasn't as universally adored as Lonerism, at least not by critics. There were definitely a few people who were annoyed that Currents wasn't pure psychedelic rock, like the Tame Impala projects of years past. But the numbers spoke for themselves, and sure enough, 5 years later, Kevin has played Coachella almost every year, even headlining in 2019, more than 4 years after the release of his last album. Tame Impala continues to grow in a way that would have never been possible if not for the deep, spacey journey to the center of Kevin's mind known as Currents. And just as an aside, in 2017, Kevin released a small but beautiful collection of remixes and B-sides from Currents. I highly recommend checking it out. Kevin is currently getting ready to release his next album, The Slow Rush. It's been a long 5 years since Currents, but Kevin's been busy touring the world, and last spring he got married. It looks like he's finally found a sense of belonging, but that doesn't mean he's going to be out of things to say. A good few tracks from the album are out already, and one of those tracks in particular stands out to me as a sign of things to come. Posthumous Forgiveness is a song about Kevin's relationship with his dad, and it showcases his most personal and literal songwriting yet. I could talk about Tame Impala all day, but for me, the secret to understanding or appreciating Kevin's music is to appreciate his character arc. Not only is he a brilliant musician capable of creating iconic melodies, fascinating sonic textures, and cohesive album experiences all on his own, but you can really see how he's grown as a person over the last 10 years in his music. It's kind of fascinating to listen to his artistic output from the Tame Impala EP to today. Kevin has always been autobiographical with his music. It's always been personal, but his perspectives have gradually become so much more mature over time. Kevin has always been autobiographical with his music. It's always been personal, but his perspectives have become gradually so much more mature over time. Long story short, sure, Kevin Parker is a loner, but you just can't help but see parts of yourself in his music as he calmly navigates his own mistakes and anxieties in a beautiful, multifaceted musical landscape. And that is exactly what makes Tame Impala so brilliant. Kevin is lonely a lot of the time. He's anxious, and sometimes he holds on to the past. But we all do that. After all, it's 2020, and loneliness is kind of in right now. This has been Volksgeist. Thank you for watching. Okay, so I didn't get to do this while I was making the video because I ran out of room on my SD card, but if you're looking for something to do while you wait for the release of The Slow Rush, I highly recommend checking out CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is the streaming service that's home to thousands of documentaries and nonfiction titles about history, science, technology, nature, and more. They also present one of the best streaming deals available anywhere at just $19.99 a year or $3 a month. But now the deal is even better because when you sign up for a yearly subscription with CuriosityStream, you also get unlimited access to Nebula. And you can try both of these services for free by following the link in the description. Nebula is a streaming service that I myself am involved in building. New Volksgeist video essays go up on Nebula completely ad-free before I put them anywhere, especially YouTube. But more importantly, the thing that really makes Nebula special are the originals. For example, my good friend Polyphonic has a fantastic Nebula original series about Led Zeppelin, and who knows, maybe there will be a Volksgeist Nebula original out soon, say in the next month or so. And lots of your favorite creators are already on Nebula, like Mr. Amazing, Middle 8, Polyphonic, Tierzoo, and more. By signing up for Nebula, you'll be supporting the educational creator community regardless of whether or not YouTube continues to support what we do. So you can sign up for a yearly subscription to CuriosityStream and enjoy their programming, as well as all that Nebula has to offer for less than $20 a year.